The world is divided into two types of people. Those who live their lives in blissful ignorance of homeowner associations, and the rest of us poor saps who know what it's like to have your life micromanaged by a board of power-drunk retirees with nothing better to do. I, Frank, am firmly in the latter camp. And the supreme leader of our little suburban Politburo was a woman named Brenda. It all started on one of those perfect autumn Saturdays. The air was crisp, the sky was a deep, cloudless blue, and the scent of decaying leaves was a sweet, earthy perfume. I was out front, leaning on a rake, admiring the masterpiece that was my front lawn. Every last maple leaf had been corralled into a dozen paper bags lining the curb. My grass was still green, and my F-150 was parked in its rightful spot on the street, gleaming in the afternoon sun. Life was good. It was simple. And it was about to be ruined by the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of sensible shoes on asphalt. I knew that sound. It was the sound of impending doom. I looked up, and there she was. Brenda, marching down the sidewalk with the grim determination of a tax auditor. She was a woman who seemed to be perpetually braced for a strong wind, her gray hair shellacked into a helmet, and her face set in a permanent state of mild disapproval. In her hand, she clutched her weapon of choice, a clipboard. "Afternoon, Frank," she said, her voice managing to be both chirpy and condescending. She didn't slow down, just executed a sharp pivot onto my walkway. "Brenda," I said, offering a tight-lipped smile. "Lovely day." "It is," she agreed, though she said it like the day's loveliness was a temporary lapse in judgment by the universe. "Just delivering the winter notices. The board passed a new bylaw at last month's meeting." She detached a sheet of paper from her clipboard and handed it to me. It wasn't just paper. It was thick cardstock, professionally printed and encased in the kind of lamination usually reserved for restaurant menus or nuclear launch codes. This was a notice designed to withstand the apocalypse. My heart sank. Nothing good ever comes on laminated paper. "Thanks," I mumbled, my eyes scanning the official-looking header. Oakhaven Estates, Homeowners Association, Winter, Mandate, 11B4. She gave a curt nod. "Make sure you read it carefully. It's effective December 1st. We're giving everyone plenty of notice." And with that, she clacked her way to my next-door neighbor Dave's house, a harbinger of bureaucratic misery. I waited until she was a safe distance away before I actually read the thing. The text was dense, full of legalese and $50 words for a 10-cent idea, but the core message was brutally simple. To ensure efficient snow removal by city plows and maintain aesthetic curb appeal during the winter months, all on-street parking is strictly prohibited from December 1st to March 31st, regardless of weather conditions. Violators will be fined $75 for the first offense, escalating, and are subject to towing at the owner's expense. I read it again, and a third time, hoping I was having a stroke and the words would rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They didn't. Regardless of weather conditions. That was the phrase that really stuck in my craw. A 4-month blanket ban. They had finally done it. They had weaponized winter. The problem, you see, was my driveway and my garage. I lived in a modest house with a 1-car garage and a driveway that could, if you squeezed, fit 1 car. The garage was my workshop, a sacred space filled with a table saw, a drill press, and a decade's worth of scrap lumber that I was definitely going to use for a project someday. It was not a car hole. That left the driveway, which belonged to my wife, Sarah. She was a nurse and often came home at odd hours, and the last thing she needed was to play musical cars with me. So my truck, my faithful F-150, lived on the street. It had lived there happily and without incident for the 6 years we'd owned the house. That evening, I presented the laminated edict to Sarah. She read it, a frown creasing her brow. "Well, that's annoying," she said, setting it on the counter. "I guess you'll have to finally clean out the garage." "You're missing the point," I said, pacing the kitchen. "This is tyranny, Sarah. Tyranny by laminate, regardless of weather conditions. So if it's 60 degrees and sunny on Christmas Day, my truck can't be out front? Does the asphalt need to breathe? Is it getting a nice winter vacation?" "Frank, please don't get worked up. It's just a parking rule." "It's never just a parking rule," I insisted, pointing a finger at the notice as if it were a venomous snake. "This is about Brenda. Remember last year? The mailbox incident?" Sarah sighed. She remembered. I'd received a violation because my new mailbox was painted eggshell white instead of the HOA-approved antique white. The two colors were visually indistinguishable to any organism without a spectrometer for eyes, but Brenda had somehow noticed. I'd spent a weekend repainting a perfectly good mailbox to appease her. "This isn't about the garage, Sarah," I said, my voice low and serious. "It's about the principle of the thing. It's about Brenda thinking she's the queen of a 50-house fiefdom, and we're all just her peasants. This is a declaration of war." Sarah just shook her head and grabbed a glass of wine. "Just don't do anything stupid, okay?" I stared out the kitchen window, my gaze falling on my truck parked peacefully under a streetlight. It looked so innocent, so unaware of the bureaucratic danger it was in. A storm was brewing, but it wasn't in the sky. It was in my head, and I wasn't going to let Brenda win. Not this time. My first move was to try the path of reason. I know. It was a rookie mistake. Attempting to reason with an HOA board is like trying to teach a cat to file your taxes. It's a noble effort, but ultimately pointless, and you're likely to get scratched. Still, I had to try. I put on a collared shirt, brushed my hair, and marched down to the community clubhouse for the November HOA meeting, armed with logic and a polite demeanor. The meeting was held in the clubhouse's sad little multi-purpose room, which smelled faintly of stale coffee and regret. Brenda sat at a folding table at the front, flanked by her 2 loyal lieutenants, Margaret, the treasurer, who guarded the HOA's meager funds with the ferocity of a dragon, and Tom, the secretary, a man whose entire personality consisted of nodding whenever Brenda spoke. About 10 other residents were scattered among the metal folding chairs, most of them looking as though they'd rather be having a root canal. When the floor opened for community concerns, I stood up. "Hi, Frank Miller, 124 Oak Street," I began. "I have a question about the new winter parking mandate." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "It's not a mandate, Frank. It's a bylaw, and it's for the good of the community." "Right, a bylaw," I said, forcing a smile. "My concern is with the regardless of weather conditions clause. It seems a bit restrictive. For many of us with single-car driveways, street parking is a necessity. Couldn't we amend it to only apply during forecasted snow events or when the city declares a snow emergency?" It was a perfectly reasonable suggestion. A compromise. A sensible solution to a shared problem. Brenda looked at me over the top of her glasses. "The bylaws are clear," she said, as if that explained everything. "Making exceptions would only create confusion. The city plows need unimpeded access at all times. This new bylaw ensures a uniform and tidy appearance for our neighborhood throughout the winter season." "But the plows only come when it snows," I countered, feeling the first stirrings of frustration. What about the other 90% of the winter when the roads are clear? It's a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. Tom, the secretary, decided to speak up for the first time. The bylaws are clear, he echoed, nodding sagely. I looked around the room for support, but was met with a sea of averted gazes. No one wanted to get on Brenda's bad side. I was on my own. I argued for another 5 minutes, but it was like talking to a brick wall. A very stubborn, condescending brick wall. I left the meeting defeated, the smell of stale coffee clinging to my clothes. Diplomacy had failed. It was time to go nuclear. For the next week, my evenings were dedicated to what I called the Covenant Deep Dive. I unearthed the 200-page Oak Haven Estates Homeowners Association Covenant, a document so dense and boring it could be used as a general anesthetic. I sat at my dining room table with a pot of coffee, a pack of highlighters, and a growing sense of madness. Sarah would walk by, shake her head, and mutter something about getting a hobby. "This is my hobby," I'd reply, not looking up from a particularly thrilling section on acceptable fencing materials. I was looking for a loophole, a crack in Brenda's legislative fortress. I read every line, every subsection, every ridiculous addendum. I learned that my trash cans could not be visible from the street for more than 12 hours. I learned that I could not erect a satellite dish larger than 18 inches in diameter. I learned that wind chimes were subject to review by the Aesthetic Committee, which was, of course, just Brenda. But I found nothing about parking that gave me an angle. It was nearly midnight on a Tuesday when I finally found it. My eyes were blurry, and my brain felt like scrambled eggs. I was in the addendum section, reading the fine print of the new winter rule for the 100th time. All on-street parking is strictly prohibited. The purpose of this bylaw is to facilitate unimpeded access for city snow removal services and to maintain a clear and safe roadway. The words swam in front of me. Facilitate snow removal. Maintain a clear and safe roadway. The rule wasn't about parking, not really. Parking was just the thing they were banning to achieve a different goal: a snow-free street. They had banned the cause, not the effect. And in that moment of sleep-deprived, caffeine-fueled delirium, a thought sparked in my mind. It was a terrible, beautiful, magnificent, and utterly insane idea. What if the spot was never snow-covered in the first place? My heart started to pound. What if my specific parking spot, the 20-foot stretch of public asphalt in front of my house, remained immaculately, perpetually clear of snow all winter long? If the stated goal of the bylaw was a clear road, and my spot was the clearest piece of road in the entire state of Ohio, how could they possibly fine me? They couldn't. It would be a paradox. They would be fining me for complying too hard. I stumbled into the living room where Sarah was reading on the couch. "I've got it," I whispered, my eyes wide. "Got what? Insomnia?" she asked, without looking up. "The solution to the parking problem," I said, my voice filled with the fervor of a mad scientist who's just reanimated a corpse. "So what if the spot was never snowy? What if it was the single cleanest, safest, most ice-free patch of asphalt in the entire neighborhood, all winter long?" She finally put her book down and looked at me. "You mean you're going to go out and shovel it every single time it snows? At 3 a.m? Frank, be realistic." A slow smile spread across my face. "Shovel? Oh no. Shoveling is for peasants. I was thinking something with a little more panache. Something with an engine. Something glorious." I grabbed my laptop from the dining table, typed furiously for a moment, and then spun it around to face her. On the screen was a grainy picture from a Craigslist ad. It showed a massive, boxy blue and white machine sitting in a dusty warehouse. The title of the ad read, 1998, Olympia Ice Resurfacer, runs good, needs blade. It was a Zamboni. Sarah stared at the screen. Her eyes went from the picture to my face, then back to the picture. She was silent for a full 10 seconds. I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable lecture, the plea for sanity. Instead, her mouth twitched. A snort escaped. Then another, and then she was leaning back against the couch cushions, howling with laughter. Tears streamed down her face as she pointed a shaky finger at the screen. "A Zamboni?" she finally gasped, wiping her eyes. "You're going to buy a Zamboni to fight with Brenda?" "Technically, it's an Olympia, which is like the Pepsi to Zamboni's Coke," I corrected, feeling a surge of pride. "But yes." She shook her head, still giggling. "I don't know if you're a genius or the biggest idiot I've ever met." "Is there a difference?" I asked, grabbing my phone. She just laughed harder. "Go on then. Call them. I have to see how this plays out." With my wife's blessing, or at least her amused bewilderment, I dialed the number on the ad. The war wasn't over. It had just entered a glorious new phase. The thing about buying a 20-year-old multi-ton ice resurfacing machine off Craigslist is that it's not like picking up a used coffee table. There's no, "Yeah, I can swing by after work and throw it in the back of my SUV." This was a logistical Everest, and I was wearing flip-flops. The Zamboni, and I was just going to call it a Zamboni because ice resurfacer sounds like a boring piece of dental equipment, was located 3 hours away, just across the state line. It was housed at a defunct ice rink called Skate-A-Palooza, which, judging by the peeling paint and boarded-up windows, hadn't seen a palooza in at least a decade. The seller was a man named Jacques, a grizzled old French-Canadian with a handshake like a vice grip, and a suspicion of anyone who didn't smell like motor oil and stale beer. He looked me up and down when I arrived. "You're the fella from the phone," he said. It wasn't a question. "The one who wants the Olympia for, how you say, street purposes?" "That's me," I said proudly. "HOA dispute." Jacques chewed on an unlit cigarillo for a moment, then let out a wheezing laugh that sounded like a rusty chainsaw trying to start. "HOA, bah, bunch of old hens, eh? I like it. I like your style, kid." He led me into the dusty, cavernous rink. The air was cold and still. In the center of the warped wooden floor sat my prize. It was bigger than it looked in the pictures. It was a beast. A beautiful, boxy, propane-powered beast. The paint was faded. There was a bit of rust on the conditioner unit at the back. But it had a certain majesty. "She runs good," Jacques said, patting its flank like it was a prize stallion. "Propane engine, strong hydraulics, the blade's dull and she needs new squeegees, but the bones are good." We spent an hour going over the machine. He showed me how to start it, how to operate the augers, and how to raise and lower the conditioner. I paid him in cash, and he counted it twice. Then came the hard part, getting it home. I had rented a massive flatbed trailer, but the rink didn't have a loading dock. What followed was 2 hours of the most stressful, least safe engineering project of my life. It involved 2 very sketchy-looking wooden ramps, Jacques' ancient pickup truck acting as an anchor, a lot of shouting in a mix of English and frustrated French, and one moment where the whole 7,000-pound machine teetered precariously on the edge of the trailer. but by some miracle, we got it loaded and strapped down. As I pulled out of the Skate-A-Palooza parking lot for the last time, Jacques gave me a salute. "Give 'em hell, kid," he yelled after me. The drive home was a white-knuckle affair. Every bump in the road made the trailer sway, and I had visions of the Zamboni breaking free and careening into oncoming traffic, causing a pile-up that would make the evening news. But I made it. I backed the behemoth into my driveway just after dark, the whole rig taking up my entire driveway and half the lawn. I threw a giant silver tarp over it, where it sat looking like a beached whale. My work had only just begun. The next morning, I made a phone call that would change everything. I knew I was out of my depth. I can build a bookshelf, I can change my own oil, but I cannot fabricate custom snow-moving attachments for an industrial ice machine. For that, I needed a professional, or at least a guy with a welder and a questionable sense of judgment. I found him in the local business listings under Gus's Farm and Fleet Repair. The ad just said, "If it has an engine and it's broke, I can fix it. No computers." I dialed the number. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. "Gus's." "Hi, my name's Frank," I began, trying to sound normal. "I was hoping to get a quote on some custom fabrication work." "What's the machine?" he grunted. "Well, it's an Olympia ice resurfacer." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of a wrench clattering to the floor. "A what?" "An ice resurfacer. You know, a Zamboni." "You building a rink in your backyard, son?" Gus asked, his voice a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "Nope," I said, deciding to just go for it. "I'm weaponizing it against my HOA." The silence this time was even longer. I thought he might have hung up. Then a deep rumbling sound started. It grew into a chuckle, then a full-throated, hearty laugh. It was the sound of a man who appreciated pure, unadulterated absurdity. "My shop opens at 7 tomorrow morning," Gus finally said, still laughing. "Bring coffee and a damn good story." Gus's workshop was a cathedral of chaos. It was a massive pole barn filled with tractors in various states of disassembly, ancient-looking lathes, and piles of scrap metal that looked like they had been there since the Truman administration. Gus himself was exactly as I'd pictured. A big man in his late 60s with a magnificent gray beard, grease-stained overalls, and hands the size of dinner plates. I told him the whole story. The laminated notice, Brenda, the mailbox. He listened patiently, sipping the coffee I brought, a slow grin spreading across his face. "So you want to turn this ice shaver into a snow eater," he said when I was done. "Essentially, yes." "I love it," he declared, slapping his knee. "It's the stupidest, most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Let's get that beast over here." What followed was the greatest montage of my life. For the next 3 weeks, I spent every spare moment at Gus's shop. He was a mechanical savant, a wizard of welding. We were no longer just fixing the Zamboni, we were upgrading it. We were transforming it. First, the primary weapon. Gus sourced a massive industrial-grade snowblower attachment from a defunct airport runway clearer. He spent days fabricating a custom mounting bracket and a hydraulic power takeoff to run it directly from the Olympia's engine. It looked ridiculously oversized, like a bulldog with a great white shark's jaw. Next, the accessories. We installed a bank of blindingly bright LED floodlights on a roof rack. "For nighttime operations," Gus said with a wink. He convinced me to add an ear-splittingly loud air horn, salvaged from a semi-truck. "For safety," he claimed, though his gleeful expression suggested it was for annoyance. The final touch was the paint job. I wanted it to look intimidating. We settled on classic flame decals licking up the sides of the machine. And on the hood, in bold, white, military-style stencil font, Gus painted its new name, The Compliance. By the time we were done, it was a masterpiece of malicious engineering. It was no longer just a Zamboni. It was a statement. Getting it back to my house was another adventure, but this time it felt triumphant. I parked it in the driveway, the tarp barely concealing its monstrous new form. The neighborhood was buzzing. People would slow down as they drove by, trying to figure out what alien spacecraft had landed in my driveway. My neighbor Dave, a chill, bearded software engineer who had his own share of run-ins with Brenda, finally came over one afternoon. "Dude," he said, "I gotta ask, what is under the tarp?" Without a word, I pulled back a corner of the tarp, revealing the snowblower, the floodlights, and the word compliance. Dave's eyes went wide. He stared for a solid minute, his brain processing the sheer audacity of it all. Then, he slowly broke into a grin that stretched from ear to ear. He looked at me, then back at the machine, and just started laughing. "Oh, this is beautiful," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. Whatever you're planning, Frank, I'm in. Let me know if you need a co-pilot." I had my machine. I had my mechanic. And now I had my first ally. All we needed now was snow. The last week of November was a tense waiting game. I checked the weather forecast with the obsessive focus of a general planning an invasion. Every day was sunny and unseasonably warm. I tinkered with the compliance in the driveway, starting it up just to hear the satisfying roar of its propane engine, making sure the hydraulics were sound. The air horn, I discovered, was loud enough to rattle the windows of my own house. Sarah made me promise to use it only in emergencies. We had very different definitions of emergency. On the evening of November 30th, the day before the HOA parking ban officially began, Brenda sent out a neighborhood-wide email. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive glee. Subject: Important reminder. Dear Oak Haven residents, this is a friendly reminder that Winter Bylaw 11B4 goes into effect tomorrow, December 1st. As per the rules, all vehicles must be removed from the street by 9 p.m. tonight and must remain off the street until March 31st. Let's all do our part to keep our community beautiful and accessible. Your cooperation is appreciated. Sincerely, Brenda, HOA President. You can just feel the smugness radiating off the screen, I grumbled, reading it over Sarah's shoulder. Just ignore her, Sarah said. Are you sure this is going to work, Frank? This whole thing is insane. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result, I said sagely. I, on the other hand, am introducing a new, very large variable into the equation. Then, that night, it happened. The local news meteorologist, with the barely contained excitement they only get for big weather events, announced the first major snowstorm of the season. A winter weather advisory was in effect. 6 to 8 inches were expected overnight. I felt a thrill shoot through me. It was showtime. I couldn't sleep. I was like a kid on Christmas Eve, if Santa was planning to deliver a blizzard and a chance to stick it to the man. I sat in the dark living room, peering through the blinds. Around 2 a.m., the first fat, wet flakes began to fall, swirling in the orange glow of the streetlights. By 4 a.m., the world outside was covered in a pristine, silent blanket of white, at least 6 inches deep. The neighborhood was asleep. The city plows hadn't come through yet. It was perfect, I slipped out of bed, put on my warmest winter gear, boots, coat, hat, gloves, and went to the garage. I grabbed a travel mug of coffee, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the freezing air. The compliance sat waiting under its tarp, a silent monster. I pulled the tarp off, the heavy, snow-covered plastic sliding to the ground with a soft whoosh. The startup sequence was a thing of beauty. I turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a throaty rumble that seemed to shake the very ground beneath my feet. I flipped a switch, and the hydraulic systems whined as they came online. I flicked another, and the bank of LED floodlights bathed the entire front of my house and the street in brilliant daylight white light. I put the machine in gear and rumbled down the gentle slope of my driveway. The chains on the tires crunched satisfyingly on the compacted snow. When I reached the street, I lowered the massive snowblower at the front, its steel auger glinting under the lights. I took a sip of coffee, engaged the blower, and pushed forward. The result was instantaneous and glorious. The machine didn't just move the snow, it obliterated it. A massive plume of fine powder erupted from the chute, which I had aimed directly at the center of my front lawn. The sound was incredible. The deep roar of the engine, the high-pitched scream of the auger, and the thunderous blast of the snow hitting the ground. It was loud, it was violent, and it was absurdly, comically effective. I made 2 slow, careful passes. In less than 10 minutes, I had cleared a perfect 20-foot by 8-foot rectangle of asphalt in front of my house. It was a pristine black void in a world of white. The pavement was so clean you could eat off it. I raised the blower, backed the compliance neatly into my driveway, and shut it down. The sudden silence was almost as jarring as the noise had been. Then, with a feeling of immense satisfaction, I got into my F-150, which had been waiting patiently in the driveway behind the Zamboni, and parked it directly in the center of the beautifully cleared spot. It fit perfectly. Legally, it was on the street, but it was sitting on dry, bare pavement, posing no threat to any snowplow that might eventually wander by. I had followed the letter of the law, if not the spirit. I went back inside, poured another cup of coffee, and sat by the window to watch the sun rise. As dawn broke, the neighborhood began to stir. The first to notice was Dave from next door. He came out onto his porch in a bathrobe, holding a mug. He saw my truck, then his eyes followed the perfectly cleared path to the monster sitting in my driveway. He froze. He looked back at the truck, then at my house. He caught my eye through the window, and a slow, respectful clap began. He raised his mug to me in a silent toast. A few minutes later, I saw a flicker of movement in Brenda's window across the street. Her curtains twitched, then were pulled back sharply. I couldn't see her expression, but I could feel the waves of pure, unadulterated fury emanating from her house. It took her less than 4 hours. By noon, tucked neatly under my windshield wiper, was the first official notice of violation. It was, of course, laminated. Violation: unauthorized operation of industrial machinery on a public thoroughfare. Fine: $75. I chuckled. I had been waiting for this. I went to my office, where I had already printed out the relevant city ordinances. I highlighted Section 8C, which detailed the types of vehicles legally permitted to operate on city streets. It included, among cars, trucks, and motorcycles, a wonderful little catch-all phrase, and other specialized utility vehicles. I also highlighted the section on property damage, noting that no property, public or private, had been damaged in any way. I typed up a polite, formal appeal letter, attached copies of the ordinances, and sealed it in an envelope. I walked across the street, slipped it into Brenda's mailbox, and raised the little red flag. The first shot had been fired. I had returned fire with meticulously researched paperwork. This was war. The next 3 months were a blur of snow, fines, and formal appeals. It became a rhythm, a bizarre winter dance between Brenda's bureaucratic rage and my malicious compliance. Every time it snowed, no matter the time, I'd fire up the compliance and clear my spot. And every time, like clockwork, a new laminated violation would appear on my truck. But Brenda was getting creative. She had moved past the industrial machinery argument after my first appeal. The second fine was for a noise violation before 7 a.m. I was ready. I sent back a copy of City Code 11-4B, which explicitly stated that snow removal equipment was exempt from municipal noise ordinances. In my appeal letter, I politely argued that while the compliance's primary function in a former life was ice resurfacing, its current modified form was unquestionably that of snow removal equipment. Checkmate. The third fine was even more desperate: improper storage of a commercial vehicle on residential property. This one almost had me, until I remembered the paperwork from the DMV. When I'd registered it, the clerk had been utterly baffled. There was no category for personal Zamboni. After a long and confusing conversation with her supervisor, they had registered it as a specialty recreational vehicle, the same category as an RV or a dune buggy. I sent Brenda a copy of the official registration, along with a cheerful note. Check and mate. My neighbor Dave became my official co-conspirator. He'd come over after every operation for a debrief, which we called our strategy sessions. "Dude, that was a masterpiece last night," he said one morning, leaning on the fence that separated our yards. "The way you banked the snow into that perfect pyramid on your lawn? Art, pure art, and thanks," I said. "But I feel like it's missing something. It needs more psychological impact." "You need music," Dave said, his eyes lighting up. "Like in the movies. When the helicopter gunships come in during Apocalypse Now, they're blasting Wagner. You need a theme song." He was a genius. The next day, I installed a waterproof, high-volume Bluetooth speaker in the cab of the Compliance. That night, during the next snowfall, the neighborhood was treated to the glorious sound of my machine clearing the street to the thundering orchestral score of Vivaldi's Winter from the Four Seasons. It was dramatic, it was classy, and it was deeply, deeply annoying to Brenda. The neighborhood was now officially a community divided. There was the Frank Tion, my silent supporters, who would give me a thumbs up as they drove by, or leave anonymous six-packs of beer on my doorstep. They saw me as a folk hero, a man fighting back against the tyranny of the HOA. Then there was the Brenda-gade, a small but vocal minority of her cronies who would glare at me from their windows and post furious, grammatically challenged rants on the official Oak Haven Estates Facebook group. The Facebook group became the digital front of our war. Brenda H. Does anyone else feel unsafe with that thing being operated in the middle of the night? It's a menace. What if a child runs out in front of it? Dave M., my Dave. At 3 a.m., Brenda, on a Tuesday? Are the children sleep plowing now? Frank's machine has more lights than the Vegas Strip. You can see it from space. It's probably the safest vehicle in the neighborhood. Margaret T., the treasurer. It's an eyesore. He's turning our beautiful neighborhood into a circus. And the noise. Frank M., me, Hi, Margaret. Just wanted to clarify that the compliance is fully compliant with all city noise ordinances for snow removal equipment. See Bylaw 11 to 4B. As for its appearance, I believe the flame decals add a certain sporty flair. Have a great day. My greatest triumph of the winter, however, came in late January. Brenda, realizing her fines were being successfully appealed, tried a new tactic. She had the HOA's lawyer, a man who looked exactly as slimy as you'd imagine, draft a cease and desist letter. It was full of threatening legal jargon about creating a public nuisance and willful disregard for community standards. It demanded I immediately cease all operations of the aforementioned ice grooming apparatus. This was her big gun. But she made a fatal error. She sent it via certified mail. I had to sign for it. The next time it snowed, I did something different. I cleared my spot as usual, blasting my classical music. But I also cleared the sidewalk in front of my house. And Dave's house. Then I kept going. I cleared the sidewalk for 3 houses down in each direction. I even cleared the little cul-de-sac at the end of our street. It took me over an hour, but by the time I was done, a huge portion of our block had perfectly clear, safe sidewalks. Then I wrote my response to the lawyer. Dear Mr. Slimington, thank you for your letter. While I dispute its claims, please be advised that as of 5:15 a.m. this morning, I have expanded my snow removal activities to include public sidewalks, thereby actively reducing public nuisance and improving community safety, especially for our elderly residents and children walking to the bus stop. My actions are, therefore, a community service. Furthermore, my vehicle, the Compliance, is equipped with a rotating amber safety beacon, which I purchased and installed to ensure maximum visibility in the spirit of proactive and community safety. Sincerely, Frank Miller, a concerned and helpful resident. The amber beacon was Dave's idea. We'd installed it the previous weekend. It sat on the roof and pulsed with an official-looking glow, making the Compliance look less like a personal project and more like a municipal vehicle. Brenda had no response. She couldn't very well punish me for clearing the sidewalks for our elderly neighbors. Her public nuisance argument was in tatters. She had escalated, and I had re-escalated with weaponized helpfulness. The winter wore on, the snow kept falling, and the Compliance kept roaring to life, a testament to the fact that with enough creativity, you can fight City Hall, or at least your HOA, and win. The war was far from over, but I was winning every battle. The only question was what desperate final move Brenda had left. February blew in with a vengeance, bringing with it the kind of blizzard that old-timers talk about for years. The news called it a snowpocalypse. The governor declared a state of emergency. Over a foot of heavy, wet snow was dumped on us in less than 12 hours, and the wind whipped it into massive drifts. It was the perfect storm. For me, it was the championship game. For Brenda, it was her last stand. I knew she would do something drastic. Her usual weapons, laminated notices, passive-aggressive emails, a slimy lawyer, were useless against me. She had one last move, the nuclear option for all neighborhood disputes: calling the cops. The storm raged all night. Around 5 a.m., when the snow finally tapered off, I suited up and went out to face the beast. The world was buried. My driveway was a solid white ramp leading to a street that had vanished under 2-foot drifts. This was a job that would have broken a lesser man's snowblower. But the Compliance was built for this. I fired her up, the engine sounding even louder in the muffled post-blizzard silence. The amber beacon sliced through the pre-dawn gloom. I lowered the giant auger and went to work. It was a battle. The snow was so heavy that I had to take it in small bites, the engine groaning under the strain. But slowly, steadily, I carved out my rectangle of freedom from the frozen chaos. It took longer than usual, a full half-hour of roaring, grinding, snow-blasting effort, but the result was even more dramatic than usual. My parking spot was a perfect black oasis in a desert of white. I parked my truck, feeling a deep sense of primal victory. I was just pouring my coffee in the kitchen when I saw them, the flashing red and blue lights, painting streaks across my living room wall. 2 police cruisers were sliding to a stop in the deep snow in front of my house. This was it, the main event. I saw Brenda across the street, standing on her porch in a full-length parka, her face a mask of grim triumph. She was pointing dramatically towards my house, a caricature of a tattletale. I took a calm sip of my coffee, grabbed the binder I'd prepared for this exact occasion, and walked outside. 2 officers got out of their cars. One was young, with a serious, chiseled jaw, and the earnest expression of a man who still believed he could make a difference. This was the rookie, Officer Rodriguez. The other was older, with a graying mustache, and the weary, seen-it-all eyes of a man who had responded to one too many calls about cats stuck in trees. This was the veteran, Officer Miller. "Morning, sir," Rodriguez said, his voice all business. "We've had a complaint." He gestured vaguely at my truck, then at the compliance sitting in my driveway. "A complaint about this whole situation." "Good morning, officers," I said calmly. "It's my snow remover, just keeping my spot clear. Per HOA regulations, you understand." Brenda, emboldened by the presence of law enforcement, marched across the street, her boots crunching in the snow. "He's a menace, officer," she screeched, her voice shrill in the cold air. "He's operating that death machine in the middle of the night. It's unregistered, it's unsafe, and he's terrorizing the neighborhood." I didn't even look at her. I just opened my binder and handed it to Officer Miller. "Everything you need should be in there, sir," I said politely. "HOA bylaw in question is on the first tab. City noise and vehicle ordinances are on the second. The vehicle's official DMV registration is on the third." Miller took the binder, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Rodriguez looked back and forth between me and Brenda, trying to maintain a serious expression. Miller flipped through the pages, his eyebrows rising slightly. He stopped on the DMV registration page. "Specialty recreational vehicle?" he muttered, then looked up at the flame-decaled monster in my driveway. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mustache. "So, let me get this straight," Miller said, looking at me. He was no longer trying to hide his amusement. "The Homeowners Association told you that you couldn't park on the street because of potential snow." "That's correct, officer," I said. "So you bought a Zamboni, attached a giant snowblower to it, and made sure there's no snow. Ever. In this one specific spot." "That's the long and short of it," I confirmed. "An act of what you might call aggressive compliance." Brenda sputtered. "It's not compliant. It's a loophole. He's mocking the rules." Miller closed the binder with a soft snap and handed it back to me. He turned to face Brenda, his expression becoming professional again, but his eyes were still dancing. "Ma'am," he said, his voice patient but firm, "I understand your frustration, but from what I can see here, this man hasn't actually broken any laws." "What?" Brenda shrieked. "His vehicle is legally registered with the state," Miller continued, ticking the points off on his fingers. "He's operating it on a public street for the purpose of snow removal, which is permitted. He's not damaging any city or private property. And according to these ordinances he's provided, which, by the way, are correct, he's not in violation of any noise laws." He sighed and looked from Brenda to me, and then to the Zamboni. "Frankly, ma'am, this is a civil matter between you and him and your HOA. It's not a police matter. We can't do anything here." The color drained from Brenda's face. This was not how this was supposed to go. The cavalry wasn't supposed to congratulate the dragon. Miller turned to me. He stepped closer and lowered his voice, so only I could hear. "Between you and me," he said, gesturing with his chin towards the compliance, "that is the most beautiful, glorious thing I have ever seen in 20 years on the force." He gave me a subtle wink, then turned and walked back to his cruiser. "Have a good day, sir." Rodriguez, looking utterly bewildered, just nodded at me and followed his partner. They got in their cars and drove away, their lights vanishing down the street. I was left alone in the snow with Brenda. She stood there, utterly defeated, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Her ultimate weapon had been a dud. Her authority was gone, vanished into the cold morning air. Without another word, she turned and trudged back to her house, a lonely, vanquished queen. I stood there for a long moment, the quiet hum of my truck's engine the only sound. The war was over. I had won. Brenda's defeat on that snowy morning was absolute and very, very public. In a small suburban neighborhood, news travels fast. The story of the police showing up, siding with me, and leaving her standing alone in a snowdrift became an instant legend. Officer Miller's "most beautiful thing I've ever seen" quote got repeated and embellished until it sounded like the mayor himself was going to give me a key to the city. Brenda's reign of terror was over. Her authority, built on a foundation of petty rules and intimidation, had crumbled under the weight of a 7,000-pound ice machine. The effect was immediate. At the very next HOA meeting, something unprecedented happened. People actually showed up. The sad little multi-purpose room was packed. Emboldened by my victory, the Frank Tian had come out in force. Dave was there, along with a dozen other neighbors I'd only ever waved to. When Brenda tried to call the meeting to order, she was shouted down. A motion was put forth for a vote of no confidence in her presidency. It passed, 28-3. Margaret and Tom were her only supporters. A new board was elected on the spot, with Dave, my co-conspirator, reluctantly accepting the role of president. Their first order of business? They held an emergency vote to repeal Winter Bylaw 11B-4. It was replaced with a single, common-sense sentence. Please avoid on-street parking during active snowstorms to assist city plows. It was beautiful. Spring arrived a few weeks later. The grimy snow melted away, revealing the green shoots of crocuses and the myrtle. Squashed beer cans that had been hidden since New Year's. The great winter war of Oak Haven Estates was officially over. I retired the compliance for the season. I gave it a good wash, changed the oil, and parked it in the driveway under its silver tarp, where it stood not as a vehicle, but as a monument to victory. A monument with flame decals. One warm evening, Sarah and I were sitting on the front porch, sipping beers and watching the sun set. My truck was parked in its rightful place on the street, and it would stay there all year long, unbothered and unfined. Sarah looked over at the hulking, tarp-covered shape in the driveway. "You know," she said with a smile, "you could have just cleaned out the garage." "I know," I said, taking a long, satisfying sip of my beer. "But where's the fun in that?" I looked at my truck, then at the quiet, peaceful street. I had fought the law, the stupid, petty HOA law, and I had won. And I'd done it with a propane engine, a whole lot of noise, and a ridiculous amount of malicious compliance. It was, without a doubt, the most satisfying thing I had ever done.